Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marnie Holloway, and I am the Consulting Services Director at TDA. Adrian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Duncan. I am a director at Civics and focus in on managing large-scale grants. Excited to be with you all this afternoon.
So during our time together this afternoon, we have several objectives that we're hoping to reach. Grantees will gain skills in preparation and planning. We'll also discuss areas of potential leverage. We will be looking at best practices and common missteps. We will also hopefully outline actionable steps for you to ensure operational readiness. And we'll also be identifying areas where alignment is critical as you're implementing your DR program. I'm clicking on the wrong thing. For our agenda today, just real quickly, we're going to go through first steps. We're going to discuss funding. We're going to discuss capacity, programming and method of distribution, common missteps and best practices. And at the end, we're going to have breakout sessions where you will have an opportunity to join subject matter experts in breakouts on citizen engagement, financial management, managing and monitoring subrecipients, and procurement and vendor management. And Adrian is going to take it from here for a bit.
Thanks, Barney. So as we move into the presentation and really begin to talk about first steps of what you need to do, one thing I want to lead with is simultaneously at the same time as this presentation and discussion is going on, there is a discussion about small grants, right? How to administer the smaller grants. And ideally, as we talked and prepared for these, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of connectivity, because as you'll learn as you begin to implement DR and mitigation dollars, $1 of DR, $1 of mitigation really changes the whole dynamic of a project and the requirements that you have. So what we'll be talking about today is really considering all of those steps that you need to take to have a successful program launch and grant launch for the larger grants. But know that all of this applies to both sides of the coin, right? If you have a large grant versus a small grant. So really it is all of that information that's critical for you to have and critical for you to work through. I know a lot of this as you're jumping into all of these sessions over the next, this during the clinic seems particularly overwhelming. There's a lot to do. Everything has a different deadline, all of those things. I would say just, first steps as we talk through this, really breaking things down into pieces. Yeah, you need to look at the whole timeline, which is for the next 6 years, but then really looking at what is your priorities as you move into what has to happen to meet each milestone and to get to the next phase of the grant. So we'll start that conversation with what are those first steps, right? The first immediate things that you need to do to really go ahead and start to build the foundation of your disaster recovery and mitigation grant. So the first piece, I know everyone here is likely working on them right now, are those financial certifications, right? And really looking through those as you pull together rapidly all of the information that you need to send in through the checklist, really determining realizing this is the foundation of the backbone of your grant, right? So these are the items that you have to show to HUD to say, hey, we have this together and we've got all of these systems in place. And we're going to continue to build on these systems, because I think with any large scale grant that you realized over the last 2 years in COVID funding and CV funding that has come through, all of that really is critical to the changes that you have to make to adjust to manage these funds. So really taking some time with your accounting teams, your finance teams, your legal teams to understand, hey, this is what we're agreeing and we're saying that we have in place. And then knowing that those pieces in the certification, that is what you're going to have to operationalize and implement. So, you know, taking some time, I know they're due pretty quickly right now, but, you know, taking that piece together and really having, you know, having some conversations and setting up those partner agencies at the state or local level, so that they're prepared to have to implement this grant. And then the second piece, right, that follows right back, and they used to be connected, right? We're submitting your financial certifications and implementation plan together. Now you're submitting them separately. And I really think it's a great decision to separate those, because the implementation plan really aligns with the action plan and determining what the programming is, what resources you're going to need at your agency to implement. So really thinking about how that aligns with the information in your action plan. And as you develop the action plan, thinking, okay, how are we going to implement this? And how do we make the right determinations to implement the plan and the programs that are outlined in our action plan. So really think of those two. While we used to think of the financial certifications and the implementation plan as married together, they're really separate now. And the implementation plan is really almost married where it should be to the action plan, as to show how you're going to implement those projects. And then the new option on the table for the 2020 class is really looking at that admin only action plan. And I can highly recommend, if you are a first time grantee and you're looking at resources that are needed, this is an opportunity that HUD is given to be able to access those resources first, to really prepare you to launch the programs. You know, a lot of times we say that disaster recovery programs are somewhat of the inverse of a small business, right? You have the funding and then you have the ideas, whether with startup business, you have the idea and then you're looking for the funding. So take this opportunity to really tap into that funding if needed, so that you can utilize it to really work through your action plan and your program design. It really allows you that ability to really capture and to maximize your resources as you launch your action plan and program design. And then really thinking about your action plan. You know, everyone right now is on the 2020 class is really in the throes of it, right? You're thinking through everything. You're looking at, okay, where are our impacts, where you're doing your unmet needs, you're determining your mitigation impacts, you're analyzing all of that data, which is really critical. Working with your state and federal partners to make sure you have as much data that's available to understand those impacts. And then really determining and spending some quality thought time on how you're going to design these programs to implement a holistic recovery. Any one grant is never going to be enough to fully meet all of the needs in the community. But what it is that backbone and that stepping stone to be able to leverage funds that you have, maybe it's state funds, other federal funds, local funds, that you can really bring to the table to say, how do we really create some programs that can be focused in on that holistic recovery? And where can we leverage what's currently happening? And we'll talk about that again a bit more in the programming section of the presentation, but we'll really talk through and think about, hey, what do we already have in place with programs, infrastructure, design, and how can we use our DR funds to continue to build that, to expand the footprint, expand the recovery dollars, and really work towards recovering our communities. So again, first steps, you really have these 4 big items that are all started in February right now, or moving towards, you're moving towards public comment, preparing for public comment at the beginning of May. So all of those items are really critical to make sure that you have the foundational aspects to really launch your grant successfully. So from there, we'll move right in just to talking about funding, right, as we went through our agenda. And that really ties to some of those first steps, right? Knowing the funding. Remember, your admin funding, we just talked that you go ahead and write that admin action plan if you need those funds. But then really being conscious of calculating that 5% admin, right? That 5% admin is for you for the next 6 years. And it always doesn't, it never seems like enough. And so really making a plan, understanding what is really administrative costs. HUD has some great resources out there to make sure that you're categorizing everything on 5%, on your 5% admin. And then really the big key piece here, and we see this repeatedly in disaster recovery grants, is understanding what is admin versus activity delivery. We see here, don't give away your admin. We see that so many times. So really taking the time to really analyze for which activities you're going to be charging to admin, what activities can be classified as activity delivery, and also spending the time up front while you're working on the action plan, while you're in program design, to work with your finance teams at your state and local entities and really determine, say, hey, we need to figure out how we're going to track this and how we're going to divide this, not only in the actual time that we're using, but also in our systems. And I think that ties into your certifications, right? And what your systems can do. So really think through that. We've had, so many grantees we've worked with that this really takes a minute to set up, and the time spent to set this up correctly reaps you benefits throughout the 6 years of your grant. So really talk to them, and also understanding that those of you that are state entities that are implementing disaster recovery projects or programs at the state level, this is a shift. You have the ability, if you are, to use activity delivery for program implementation, which is a change from your regular program. So I mentioned that because that really is something that we want to push. You want to have the conversation with your finance team, because they've likely been set up in a way that they've done your regular grant the same way for the last 20 years. So having a conversation to say, hey, these are CDBG funds, but they're going to be different. And we have the ability to determine, to use some of our time as activity delivery. It really helps you expand the footprint, the financial footprint of what you can do. And then finally, when we talk about funding, also define the roles between grantees and subrecipient. Who is responsible for admin? Who's responsible for delivery? And how are you allocating the funding? We've had many grantees that we've come in and had discussions with, and they've written subrecipient agreements to give their subrecipients admin, and not realizing that admin that you give your subrecipients also hits your 5%. It's not a 5% for everyone, it's one bucket. So really, you have to really be controlling of that admin, because it's got to last you the 6 years. So really making sure, as you're determining, your program design, your method of distribution, that you're allocating those funds correctly. You're understanding the responsibilities and the expectations of what you need from your subrecipients and what bucket of funding that falls in. And then looking to your second funding option here is the planning funds. 15% of your grant can be used for planning, right? So that allows you that allows you a cap in your planning bucket, but it also allows you, when you have a large grant, like many of you do that are participating in this session, how are you going to use that planning? Remember, you can, planning is subrecipient capacity building, and we're going to talk about the importance of subrecipient capacity building throughout this session. Your subrecipients are an extension of you. If you are engaging them to implement a DR program or a mitigation program, for many of them, this may be new. And then additionally, for many of them, the allocation of the program that they are implementing may be 2, 3, 4, 5 times their annual allocation. So utilizing this planning funds as subrecipient capacity building is really critical to make sure that they have the capacity to be a good partner with you to implement the funds. And we'll continue to talk about that and what are some strategies for making sure that they're set up for success, because their success is your success. and their success is the success of the entire state or the entire recovery. So, providing those tools and resources for them is really critical. And then really considering, a lot of disasters are expanding, expand geographies. You've got disasters in California that span wide geographies, others that expand whole states or certain portions of state. You consider in the beginning, you have 6 years, which does go by very fast, but considering some planning on the onset really can help you have meaningful programs and have meaningful outputs in the long haul. So really considering, okay, do we need to add in a planning mechanism so that some of these local communities can look at their recovery holistically and determine how they're going to holistically recover before they just jump into program. How does it all tie together? And that's what this 15% is for. And so making sure that you've carved out some time for that. And then activity delivery, as we've talked about, this is really critical to make sure that you've separated your admin and your activity, and that when you're developing and implementing programs and projects, that you're using those funds as activity delivery, right? As we talk about it, you can see in HUD recordings and of other presentations, if you can tie a string to that activity or that program, it is activity delivery. So, it's policies, procedures, environmental reviews, application intake, eligibility, all of that work, you've got to develop all of this to implement it. All of that is tied to the outcomes. You don't have a project application, you don't have a project. So developing that project application is tied straight to the implementation. It is all activity delivery. And it takes some of the pressure off of that admin that you've previously been using. So really consider, taking that time up front to divide in the responsibilities and making sure that what activity delivery is activity delivery. And then your mitigation set aside, right? This is new for your 2020, for the 2020 class. Make sure you've got that 15% requirement that you have to meet. So as you're looking at program design and as you're looking at the programs that you're going to set aside, how are you going to meet the 15%? So really, I think holistically, we'll talk about mitigation, is setting up your budgets to say, hey, here's our 5% admin. Here's our potential 15% planning. Here's our 15% mitigation. Here's the remaining funds we have for DR programs. And really looking at it at that base is going to really help you make some decisions and some quick decisions, right? You're looking at your action plan, that 120 days goes by very fast. So really thinking through, okay, how does mitigation fit into our programs, or what will the 15% set aside be? Will we have a standalone project? So really having those conversations, not only just in the program vacuum, and we'll talk about that soon, but also in the financial background. So connecting the two pieces to say, hey, how is our mitigation plan and program going to fit into our disaster recovery allocation? And with that, I am going to kick it over to Marcy for capacity.
Capacity, one of my favorite topics. Okay. So capacity impacts your DR work from multiple angles. It is your capacity, it is your partner's capacities, it is other governmental agencies that you may be working with, their capacity. It could be other fund sources that are available to you, and what is the capacity in those programs, and all of these questions of what are you capable of as you sit right now, and what are your partners capable of as they sit right now, and where do they need to move to in order to effectively implement your program. So of course it's important to know your disaster, know the recovery needs of your community, and have a capacity assessment process that aligns with the method of distribution and programming decisions and discussions that you're having as you're working through your implementation plan and your action plan. It doesn't make a lot of sense to submit an action plan that says we're going to do X, Y, and Z when you're really only capable of X and Y. And capacity assessment is a process of being honest with yourself and with your community and with your partners. You will need to know your capacity and your subrecipient's capacity. So what can you do well based on what you have in front of you, what you have available to you right now, and what do you need to build? So where are your knowledge and capacity gaps? What resources do you need to bring to bear in order to fill those gaps? Your ability to run multiple programs or focus on just one. It's tempting to decide you're going to do all things, but maybe you're not ready for that. Maybe that needs to be part of that phased approach that Adrienne mentioned. Maybe that's something that you need to bring in a new partner you haven't worked with in the past because they have that expertise. You're also going to be managing expectations across the board for everyone involved, so that everyone is aware of what these outcomes are, that what your goals are, and what you are doing with your capacity to achieve those goals. Using technology to be as efficient as possible to support record keeping, reporting, financial tracking, and other aspects. I love this one. So say you have a homeowner repair program that you have a nonprofit subrecipient who's been doing a great job with 5 houses a year because they're keeping track of them on a giant whiteboard in their office. And you're going to ask them to triple their capacity in order to take on your DR program. So things like record keeping, reporting, financial tracking can trip you up if you aren't including those pieces in your capacity assessment, both of yourself and of your partner organizations. You may need to, as Adrienne mentioned, use some of that planning, that 15%, in order to assist your subrecipient to understand where they need additional tools. So again, with planning, figuring out your needs and the disaster's unmet needs, and addressing that 15% mitigation set aside. As Adrienne mentioned, the mitigation set aside could be addressed through a separate program, or it could be incorporated into your more traditional disaster recovery work. And which direction are you and your partners going to be best able to implement that mitigation? Allowing time to plan for large-scale programs. Going from 10 units to 100 units isn't necessarily a matter of more eaches. Each of those eaches need to be addressed also. And you need to allow time to plan for that larger scale piece. Also, planning to keep planning. Planning is an iterative process. You'll have 6 years to get to the goal. So as you are planning for your implementation, set some milestones, set some dates. Say, 6 months from now, we're going to sit down and look at our planning again and decide if we need to do something else or go another direction. Maybe a year later, you have a new fund source coming in, and maybe you need to readjust a little bit. So planning isn't a once and done. It's not a write it down on a piece of paper, stick it in a file, put it in a drawer, and you're over with. You need to be continuing your planning efforts and continuing to assess capacity as your program is moving along. And then you can build on existing resources. So grantees will have staff who are expert in environmental reviews and clearance, labor standards, Section 3. That staff may need some additional support in order to take on the additional workload, but you have that expertise staff right there. So let's make use of what we have. Also, scaling up existing, so your internal processes and your administrative processes. So your folks who are processing payments in your accounting division, are they going to need additional resources in order to effectively handle their piece of the work that needs to be completed in order to get those payments out the door? Do you need additional inspection staff? Those kinds of questions, you need to be prepared to scale those resources up, and prepared to scale those resources up in a way that makes sense for the work that you're doing. You may not need them all tomorrow, but you're going to need them next year. So let's plan on having that capacity and plan on bringing in those resources when they are needed. You can modify or build from existing programs. I mentioned a minute ago your nonprofit who's been doing a great job with your home rehab program likely could take on some DR rehab work. Again, it's a question of their capacity also. If you have a tax credit program, then you probably are ready to go with disaster recovery multifamily, because many of these, all of the same project evaluation pieces and underwriting and feasibility questions will transfer from one program to the other. So use the capacity that you already have. The other thing that you can do is partner with other agencies to fill gaps and get launched quickly. For instance, FEMA has in their public assistance and their hazard mitigation grant programs, tax credits, depending on where you are in your tax credit cycle, you potentially could access those immediately, or it could be another year. Again, something you can plan for, and you can assess your capacity to take that on in the future. Other fund sources are potentially other federal and state resources. As Adrian mentioned, potentially local funds, if there are local funds available to assist with your disaster recovery. So it's again, it's an iterative process, and it needs to be an honest process about where our capacity is, where our partners' capacity is, so that you are able to use the resources that you have available to you through the DR funds and through the DR resources to bring the capacity level up so that you are able to meet your goals, meet those outcomes that you have set for the program. I'm going to hand this back over to Adrian.
Great, thanks, Marnie. So as we move in, really digging through what is the next thing to consider, especially as we look at large grantees and implementation, right? That daunting number, $600, $700 million. What does this mean to implement this? And so then the second piece, right? We've talked about setting up your financing, understanding the budget, understanding the parameters of it. Working with your finance team to begin to set up that underlying infrastructure to make sure you can handle the grant. Then as Marnie talked about, we've got the capacity, right? How do we build our capacity or our subrecipients' capacity to be able to do this, right? And to do it successfully. And then as we begin to think about that and how that aligns in with our action plan, then we need to talk about what are we going to do, right? What programs are we going to run? Who's going to run them? What is the timing going to be? All of those things. How do we really align all of this together? So we'll talk for a few minutes about the program design and method of distribution, right? First, you've got your teams right now that are running data, looking at it, analyzing it, running that unmet needs methodology, right? They're looking at what are our unmet needs? How does it align with HUD's methodology? Do we have other layers to put in there? What information do we have? So, and that is the basis, right? That is going to align with how and what programs you implement. That has to be tied to what needs do you have. So really looking at that, and then understand to the prioritization or to phasing. Not everything as soon as you get your grant agreement, you don't have to launch every single program. That is not realistic. right? You know, if you look at some of your really large scale grantees like Puerto Rico and California, they have not launched all programs. You know, Puerto Rico, I think now has all of their programs launched, but it takes time, right? You have to make sure that you have capacity to do it. So really phasing, where are the immediate priorities? Generally, typically speaking, this is housing, your single family or multifamily housing, right? Those are the immediate needs. You have people that are displaced there. They're living somewhere else because of the disaster. So determine how you're going to phase and what that looks like. And how you're going to roll out the programs and the timing is really critical. The second piece is really as you begin to look through program design and look through how you're going to implement it. This is really critical in what we have in italics here. Do not do it in a vacuum. You need the input from the public, from your key stakeholders, from the subrecipients. You know, they're the ones on the ground that are implementing, that are in the disaster world, right? They are living that disaster day to day. They understand what's going on, and they're going to be your partners to implement it. So we can't emphasize enough making sure that, you know, how you're doing outreach, how you're engaging them and getting the input during the program design phase and during your action plan to say, hey, how does this meet the needs? You know, because there could be, you know, a very great program design, but it doesn't, it only looks at an urban area of rebuilding homes versus a rural area of rebuilding homes. So really being conscious of the needs of those communities, and the best way to get that is the stakeholders, the public, and your subrecipients who can really be partners at that conversation. And then really having some processes, right? You know, you can spend, you know, you could have meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting discussing program design, right? You can go as grandiose as you want, you can go as small as you want, but really having some metrics and deadlines and decisions. You know, we've utilized some really key documents and tools in some of our work that talk about how do we determine program design? What is the question we're trying to answer? What is the need we're trying to meet? You know, then what is the consideration for that decision? And what are you know, pros and cons? And then when did we make a decision? You know, being very critical and documenting that process is so important, because not all of you are going to be here for 6 years through the entire grant. So it is really important to have a documented process of how you came to the program design that you put in your action plan, so that people after you, or that in 3 years when you said, wait, we made that decision for a very specific reason, and I can't remember why, you can go back to your program design documents and say, hey, we made this decision because we wanted to launch multifamily to align with the tax credit calendar, and that's why it's on this schedule, and it's right there for you. So really documenting that process internally before it gets into your action plan is really critical, because it shows the why, right? It allows you to go back and think through it. Or maybe there was a decision you made because of an environmental impact, or because it was so recent from the disaster that you can change later on because of different conditions or change. A great example of that is you have a lot of grantees that wrote action plans in 2017, 2018, and then the whole world changed in 2020. So there had to be maybe a shift in how it was implemented, or the priorities that to meet the disaster, to be able to meet the disaster needs in a COVID world. So all of those things happen, but if you have your basic document that you can track those decisions, it's really critical. And then the second piece is who's going to administer and implement, right? You have the desire, you have the ability to have grantee implemented at the state level, subrecipients implement, you bring in contractors to implement, to support implementation. All of those things are options on the table. So really utilizing that in your program design to say, okay, hey, we're going to do a multifamily program. Is the state implementing it? Okay, or what are the pros and cons of the state implementing it? What are the pros and cons of the locals implementing it and subrecipients? And so really determining that process in the design, because that also ties to the capacity. You have to know, you can't just decide, hey, I'm a state, we've done this, we are a pass through normally, so we're just going to be a pass through again. Well, again, as I said, disaster recovery funding could be 300, 400, 500 times the amount of funding that a jurisdiction gets in their annual program. If they don't have the capacity to implement it for you, that is not a great design, right? So there's mitigation efforts you can have in there to build their capacity, but you have to think through that whole process of the implementation from start to finish. And then remember, no matter who implements it, your subrecipient, the contractor, you are the one that is responsible. So that means that HUD is coming first to you to monitor, then to your subrecipients. But as the subrecipient guidance says and everything there, right? Subrecipients are an extension of you. They are operating on your behalf. You are responsible for making sure that they meet all of their requirements, and that you're really, especially in the newer disaster recovery grantees, you're handholding them for a bit to make sure that they can implement those projects for you. And then really, okay, taking a step back, we've decided what your unmet needs are, you've decided what your programs that you want to do. How do you determine the allocations? So remember, your allocations should really align. They must align with your unmet needs, right? How are you tying those two pieces together? What are your unmet needs, and how do your program allocations align with it? And then you have all the other wonderful overall benefit requirements that we have to consider. Where are we on national objective? How are we meeting that 70%? How are we looking at that 70%? Remembering, okay, we have one grant, we have two grants, how is it all going to meet there? Then we're looking at the mid. Okay, how are we prioritizing in program design mid versus non-mid areas, and what's eligible? Really considering those two big buckets, right? You've got a lot of factors in there, that 70%, the 80%, looking at both of them holistically to make sure that you're making feasible programmatic decisions. And then the other piece is making sure you're considering all of the FRN requirements. Thankfully, as we move into 2020 and we move into the universal notice, and you're going to have some individual requirements, but making sure that you're gut checking back to the FRN, or are there waivers and alternative requirements that were given that you have to consider in your program design. Keep gut checking that all the way through the process. And then really making sure that you've aligned everything with your unmet needs, your mid, your LMI, and ongoing analysis. Like, this isn't a one and done, right? You do it at the time of the action plan, and then you've created a financial, a budget tracking mechanism through your systems, through the programs, to really constantly be analyzing it. Hey, where are we in our owner-occupied program? How many people do we have in? How much funding is that going to be? What's going to be the split? How does that all shift, right? It is always a moving pieces or a moving puzzle that you're putting together to make sure that it works. When you can give something in one area, you can take away in the other. And so really making sure that you have determined, your leadership and your critical stakeholders that need to be at the table that can continually analyze that and provide updates. And so it's really important, as we talk about, capacity and documentation, record keeping, all of those really critical pieces all align with it, because without all of that, you can't make the decisions on aligning all of these things together. So making sure that you've got all of that infrastructure, that you're putting it together on the front end. It seems overwhelming and there's a lot of steps to it in the beginning, but it really sets you up for success long term. So again, think about all of the programs. How are you setting them up, and how are they going in the DR-GR? How are you tracking them? Maybe you think your housing program is going to be 80% LMI and 20% urgent need in the beginning, but then you realize after you receive applications, we're only going to be able to fund the LMI. How have you set that up in the DR-GR? Do you need to make a change? Being flexible and being communicative and always analyzing, and really always coordinating with your subrecipients, your vendors, so that you have the most information so that you can continue the iterative process. And really then tracking milestones and metrics. How often are you looking at all this? Are you looking, you're looking at it quarterly to submit your QPRs, but are you looking at it monthly, having a meeting to say, hey, where are we on expenditures? Where are we on our admin? How is this working? All of those things are so critical, especially as we look at some of the waivers and alternative requirements across grants, to really set it up, because you may have one, you all are in the large grant conversation right now. Maybe your next grant is a small grant, but they still coordinate together. Your admin could still be utilized across both grants. So how are you tracking metrics and milestones across those grants, whether it's admin, whether it's ADCs, whether it's your planning dollars, to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements? So I really think, as you look at your capacity and you begin to work on all of this, having a really strong internal financial team and reporting team and data management team is critical from the beginning, because they can start, you start with your big bucket of money, and you can begin to maneuver and work it. And they understand all of it. They need to understand the whole picture. So we've given you an overview of kind of how do you launch these things, and how do you work through this. So I'm going to switch into some final steps of common missteps and some best practices that we've seen over the years, and just provide some tips and tricks, really, right? The first common misstep, and we've talked about this, is subrecipients can and should do it all. And really, they can't. That's the bottom line. It has to be a partnership between the grantee and their subrecipients. It's critical. You're the one on the hook for their work. You can't just sign a subrecipient agreement and say, here's your allocation. It really is making sure that you're working hand in hand with them week by week, sometimes day by day, to get them to implement those projects if they're going to be at their table. It's also considering using your planning dollars or using support to build their capacity. The other piece we have used with the subrecipients is having them do a mini certification, saying, hey, you grantee had to submit your certifications to HUD. Maybe it doesn't have to be that extensive, but having them show you they've got a procurement process. What is their financial management process? Do they have some of those critical infrastructure documents that they can follow and will follow to ensure that they can implement the grant for you? So really making sure that this is a partnership and not just a pass-through on DR. Under or over designing programs, we see this a lot. You've overthought it. Every program is going to be evolving. I don't think there has been one program in the disaster recovery world that has not had a change to it during implementation. So thinking, doing the best, thinking of the most holistic approach you can to that program, designing it, and then looking and moving forward to implement it. But you need to be able to be flexible and know that there's going to be changes. And then the final item that we see all the time is, we'll just copy that XYZ policy. I can't tell you how many, policies we've read that were for someone in Texas that have North Carolina written in them. It is always good to collaborate, but you really have to make sure that if you get a sample policy, whether it's from another entity or another jurisdiction, or whether it's from another state, your home program or your regular program, really that you own it and that you've right-sized it to fit your needs. Every program is different. Every outcome is different. And so really taking the time that gets you, right, maybe 20%, 30% of it, but taking the time to really own that policy to make sure that it matches the DR needs. And then best practices, really plan to evolve and keep planning. I know Marnie spoke about this, we'll keep it. Remember, I think we've had, seen jurisdictions that say, we're gonna have to change the action plan. Yes, hundreds of times, especially with large scale grantees. If you have $1 billion, you will change the action plan over and over again because you will learn as you implement. You'll find different things, you'll make different changes. All of those things will be critical. So plan on evolving, understanding, creating the process. How do you set yourself up to success to analyze every quarter and say, are there changes we need to make? Are we making them? What is the process that we're doing? Remember, if you're doing a substantial action plan amendment, you've got 30 days of public comment and HUD's got 45 to 60 days to review. So that time takes some time to make that change. So considering all of those things, really making sure you've got clear documents outlining the grant requirements for subrecipients. Especially you big grantee classes, right? Big dollar amounts. Subrecipients are so eager to sign on that line. Oh yeah, we'll take it. That sounds great. We're going to take the money. Make sure you've got documentation with them that they understand what they're signing up for. They understand the parameters. This isn't a regular allocation from the annual program. This is different. So making sure they really understand what your expectations are. To that point, really, really consider mini certifications for subrecipients. They may not be as excited as you are about many certifications in the beginning, but again, it will really go the extra mile to have a partnership with them that is really critical and really successful. If they understand they've got to do procurement correctly and that you're working with them to say, these are the changes you have to make to meet these requirements up front, it's a much easier conversation than coming to the subrecipient after and saying, oh, well, you procured it incorrectly and now we have a finding and the potentially to pay back to HUD. That's not a conversation anyone wants to have. So really doing as much work with them up front. And I think that wraps up our initial presentation. We are going to then move into the breakout sessions. I know we're running a couple minutes behind. And we have 4 breakout sessions: citizen participation, financial management, subrecipient management, and procurement. And I am going to kick it over to ICF to walk through the steps of the breakout session.